The thermometer outside Jake Morrison's cabin read -72 degrees Celsius. In the heart of Alaska's frozen wilderness, 300 miles north of Fairbanks, the small village of Coldfoot had been cut off from civilization for 6 weeks. The winter storm that hit in early December had buried roads, knocked out power lines, and transformed the already isolated community into a frozen island where 23 families now faced their most brutal test of survival. Jake stood by the frosted window of his wooden cabin, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air despite the fire crackling behind him. At 47 years old, his weathered face told stories of 30 winters in this unforgiving land. His calloused hands, scarred from years of ice fishing and wilderness survival, trembled slightly as he held a near-empty bag of rice. It was the last of their stored food. His daughter, Emma, just turned 16 last month, sat wrapped in 3 layers of blankets at the kitchen table, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her usually bright blue eyes were dimmed with worry. She hadn't complained once. Not when the portions got smaller. Not when they started skipping meals. Not even when her mother's wedding ring had to be traded for 2 cans of soup from the Hendersons next door. Where is Mom right now? Emma wondered, staring at the empty chair across from her. Sarah Morrison had died 2 years ago from pneumonia, and winters had never been the same. Her mother always knew how to stretch supplies, how to keep spirits high when the darkness pressed in from all sides. Jake walked to the radio transmitter, the only link to the outside world that still functioned on battery power. He'd been trying for days to reach the emergency services in Fairbanks, but static was all that came back. The village's satellite phone had frozen and cracked 3 weeks ago. They were truly alone. A knock on the door broke the silence. Jake opened it to find Thomas Chen, the village's former chef who had moved here 5 years ago, seeking peace after his restaurant in Seattle went bankrupt. Thomas's Korean-American heritage meant he'd grown up respecting elders and community, values that served him well in Coldfoot's tight-knit society. "Thomas, we're down to our last supplies," Jake said, his voice heavy with the weight of leadership he never asked for but accepted when the storm trapped them all. Thomas stepped inside, brushing snow from his thick parka. "I know. The Richardsons are burning furniture to stay warm. Old Pete hasn't eaten in 2 days, keeps giving his portions to his grandkids. We need a miracle, Jake. We need it now." Emma stood up, letting the blankets fall from her shoulders. "What about the lake?" she asked quietly. "Dad, you always said the winter fish run deeper when it's this cold. Bigger catches. What if we try the deep ice fishing? The old way like Grandpa taught you?" Jake's jaw tightened. "Emma, in this temperature out on that ice for hours, maybe days. It's suicide. The wind chill alone could kill us in minutes if we're not careful. But staying here waiting to starve is definitely suicide," Emma countered, her voice steady despite her fear. "Mom used to say you were the best ice fisherman in all of Alaska. Prove it, Dad. Save us." Thomas looked between father and daughter, then spoke quietly. "She's right, Jake. I'll help. We'll need every able-bodied person who can handle the cold. If we work together, if we can pull off even half of what you used to catch in the old days." Jake walked to the wall where his father's antique ice fishing equipment hung like relics from another era. The massive augers, the reinforced lines, the nets strong enough to haul thousands of pounds. His father had once pulled 5,000 kilograms of salmon and trout in a single 3-day expedition during the brutal winter of 1978. It had fed Coldfoot for 3 months. "Can we even find the school?" Emma asked, moving beside her father. "The lake's completely frozen. 3 meters of ice at least." Jake touched the old equipment, memories flooding back. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "When death comes knocking, son, you don't open the door. You grab your gear and you fight back with everything you've got." He turned to face them both, and for the first time in weeks, something like hope flickered in his eyes. "We leave at dawn. Gather everyone who can walk and work. Bring every warm piece of clothing, every tool we have. We're going to drill through that ice and pull up enough fish to feed this village through to spring." Thomas nodded, already mentally cataloging who could help and what supplies remained. Emma grabbed her father's hand, squeezing tight. "We can do this," she whispered. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the temperature continued its merciless drop. The frozen lake waited in darkness, holding beneath its crystalline surface either salvation or doom for the desperate village of Coldfoot. Dawn broke over Coldfoot with the kind of pale, reluctant light that barely qualified as morning. Jake stood before 12 volunteers gathered outside his cabin, their faces wrapped in scarves, eyes the only visible feature in a sea of winter gear. Emma stood beside him, her determination unwavering despite the brutal cold that turned each breath into frozen crystals. The walk to Lake Frozen Heart took 40 minutes through waist-deep snow. Each step was agony, fighting against wind that cut through layers of clothing like invisible knives. Old Pete collapsed twice before they even reached the shoreline. Thomas helped him up both times, but Jake could see the fear spreading through the group like a contagion. When they finally reached the lake's edge, the sight before them crushed what little hope remained. The ice stretched endlessly, a pale blue desert unmarked by any sign of life beneath. 3 meters thick, maybe more. Jake's father had special equipment, industrial-grade augers that could punch through. All they had were hand-crank drills and axes that seemed pitiful against nature's fortress. "This is insane," muttered Richard Cooper, a former oil rig worker who'd moved north to escape his past. His face was already showing signs of frostbite, red patches spreading across his cheeks. "We'll die out here before we drill through 10 centimeters. Jake ignored him, studying the ice, reading it the way his father taught him. He knelt down, pressing his ear against the frozen surface, listening. There. A faint current, barely perceptible. The fish were there, schooling deep, their massive winter migration happening in the dark waters below. "We drill here," Jake commanded, marking an X with his boot. They worked in 30-minute shifts, 3 people at a time cranking the hand drill while others huddled together for warmth. After 2 hours, they'd penetrated barely 40 centimeters. Emma's hands were bleeding inside her gloves, the skin cracked and raw from gripping frozen metal. She didn't stop. Then disaster struck. Michael Henderson, drilling with desperate fury, pushed too hard. The ancient hand drill's shaft snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The metal head disappeared into the partial hole they'd created, their primary tool now irretrievably lost. "No, no, no," Michael screamed, falling to his knees. His wife, pregnant with their second child, was back in the village rationing the last jar of preserves. "We're finished. We're all finished." The wind picked up, and in its howl, Emma heard what sounded like her mother's voice, or maybe just her own desperate imagination crying out against the dying of the light. Emma refused to accept defeat. While the others stood paralyzed by despair, she walked across the ice, her boots crunching with each determined step. She stopped 20 meters away, staring down at the frozen surface with an intensity that made Jake follow her. "Dad," she called out, her voice cutting through the wind. "Remember what Grandpa's journal said? The one Mom used to read to me before bed?" Jake's heart skipped. Sarah had treasured that journal, filled with his father's handwritten notes about surviving Alaska's worst winters. "Emma, what are you thinking?" "The explosives method," Emma said, turning to face him. "Grandpa wrote about it. 1978, when his drill broke, he used controlled charges. Small explosives placed strategically to crack the ice in a web pattern. Then they could break through the weakened sections with axes and poles." Thomas moved closer, his eyes widening. "That's incredibly dangerous. One miscalculation and we could crack the entire sheet, fall through, drown in seconds. Or we could do nothing and starve slowly." Emma shot back. "Which death do you prefer?" Jake's mind raced. His father had indeed used that method, but it required precision, experience, and materials they didn't have. Or did they? Wait, the old mining shed, 2 miles east. When the copper mine shut down in '93, they abandoned equipment. There might be blasting supplies still stored there. Richard Cooper stepped forward, his earlier fear replaced by something else. "I worked demolitions in the Army before the oil rigs. If we can find stable dynamite and detonators, I can set the charges. But Jake, your daughter's right about the risk. This goes wrong, we're all dead." "We're dead anyway," Old Pete croaked, his voice raspy from cold. "At least this way we die fighting. I'm 83 years old. Seen a lot of winters. Never seen people give up without swinging. Let's swing. The decision was made. Jake, Thomas, and Richard trudged through the snow toward the abandoned mining shed, while Emma and the others began marking optimal charge points on the ice based on Grandpa Morrison's journal entries, which Emma had memorized word for word during those bedtime stories with her mother. If you're watching this story unfold and rooting for this village to survive, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next, the explosion that will either save or doom Coldfoot, is just the beginning of something nobody saw coming. 2 hours later, they returned with a metal case containing 6 sticks of dynamite, miraculously preserved in the shed's dry, frozen interior, and a hand-crank detonator that looked like it belonged in a museum. Richard examined each stick carefully under the fading afternoon light. They're stable. Cold actually helped preserve them. We've got one shot at this. He positioned the charges in a hexagonal pattern across the ice, following Emma's calculations. Everyone retreated to the shoreline, taking cover behind rocks and fallen trees. Richard's hands shook as he connected the wires to the detonator. He looked back at Jake one final time. For Coldfoot? For Coldfoot, Jake confirmed. Richard cranked the handle. The world exploded. The explosion sent massive cracks spider-webbing across the ice like lightning frozen in time. The sound echoed off the surrounding mountains, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundation of the frozen lake. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that sounded almost alive, a section of ice the size of a basketball court shifted, fractured, and began to separate. It worked. Thomas breathed, his words barely audible over the creaking ice. It actually worked. They rushed forward with axes, poles, and ropes, attacking the weakened sections with furious energy. The ice that had seemed impenetrable hours ago now gave way in massive chunks. Emma swung her axe with strength she didn't know she possessed, each strike fueled by memories of her mother, thoughts of the starving families back in Coldfoot, and a burning refusal to let this wilderness claim any more victims. Within 30 minutes, they'd created a hole 3 meters wide that punched through to the dark water below. Jake peered into the abyss, and what he saw made his heart race. Silver scales, thousands of them, moving in the depths like a living river of salvation. The winter salmon run, exactly where his instincts said they'd be. They're here, he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Deploy the nets. Everyone positions now. The ancient nets, hand-woven by his father decades ago, unfurled into the icy water. The system was simple but effective. Sink the nets deep with weighted edges, wait for the school to swim through, then haul up with combined strength. In theory, it worked perfectly. In practice, in -72 degrees with exhausted, half-frozen people, it was nearly impossible. Pull, Jake commanded. Every muscle in his body screamed as he gripped the frozen rope. Beside him, Emma pulled with everything she had. Thomas, Richard, Old Pete, Michael, and the others formed a human chain, their combined strength fighting against the weight of thousands of fish. The net began to rise. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it emerged from the dark water. And when it broke the surface, what came with it made several people cry. Fish. Hundreds of massive winter salmon, each one weighing 15 to 20 kilograms. Their silver bodies thrashing in the net. But this was just the first haul. Again, Jake ordered. Drop the nets again. They worked like machines, beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, beyond the cold that should have killed them. Each haul brought more fish. 500 kilograms. 1,000. 2,000. The pile on the ice grew into a mountain of silver, a monument to human determination against impossible odds. As the sun began to set on the 4th hour of fishing, Jake checked their total weight using the old scale system. His eyes went wide, and when he announced the number, his voice shook. 5,500 kilograms, he said. We did it. We actually did it. Emma collapsed to her knees on the ice, tears freezing on her cheeks, and laughed. Mom, she whispered to the sky, we made it. The journey back to Coldfoot transformed into a triumphant procession. They fashioned sleds from broken tree branches and rope, loading them with as much fish as they could transport. The rest they buried in snow near the lake, nature's perfect freezer, marking the location with tall poles so they could retrieve more in the coming days. When the group crested the final hill overlooking the village, someone spotted them. Within minutes, the entire population of Coldfoot emerged from their cabins, 23 families standing in the frozen twilight, watching the impossible become real. Jake led the procession into the village center, pulling the largest sled. Behind him, Emma walked with her head held high, no longer the worried teenager who'd sat wrapped in blankets just yesterday. She was something else now, forged in ice and desperation into someone stronger. Thomas immediately took charge of the fish distribution. His years as a chef meant he understood portions, preservation, and preparation. We smoke half, freeze the rest in the outdoor cache, and we start cooking tonight. Everyone eats. No exceptions. Old Pete's grandchildren ran to him, wrapping their small arms around his legs. He lifted the youngest, a 4-year-old girl named Lily, and spun her around despite his exhaustion. Grandpa brought dinner, sweetheart. Lots and lots of dinner. Michael Henderson rushed home to his pregnant wife, carrying 2 massive salmon. She met him at the door, her hand on her swollen belly, tears streaming down her face. He pulled her close, and for the first time in weeks, neither of them felt the crushing weight of fear. That night, Coldfoot held a feast unlike any in its history. Thomas worked his culinary magic, preparing the salmon a dozen different ways. Grilled over open fires, smoked with alder wood, made into rich stews with the last of their vegetables, pan-fried with wild herbs someone had dried last summer. The smell of cooking fish filled the air, and for the first time in 6 weeks, every person in the village went to bed with a full stomach. Jake sat on his cabin's porch, watching the northern lights dance across the sky in ribbons of green and purple. Emma came out and sat beside him, wrapped in her mother's old quilt. Mom would be proud, Emma said softly. Your mother was always proud of you, Jake replied, putting his arm around his daughter. But today, watching you fight, watching you refuse to give up, I saw her in you. That strength, that fire, that's all Sarah Morrison. And all Jake Morrison too, Emma smiled, leaning against her father's shoulder. The next morning, the radio crackled to life. After 7 weeks, the storms had finally cleared enough for communication. Help was coming, roads were being cleared, supplies would arrive within days. But Coldfoot no longer needed rescue. They'd saved themselves. Richard Cooper stood by the community board, posting a new message, Winter of 2024. The year Coldfoot remembered who we are. Never forget. The village that had faced extinction now stood stronger than ever, bound together by shared survival and the knowledge that when everything falls apart, community and courage can pull miracles from frozen lakes. 3 years later, Coldfoot, Alaska looked different. The village that once teetered on the edge of extinction had transformed into something remarkable. A large wooden sign at the entrance read, Welcome to Coldfoot, where community survives everything. Population, 47. The population had nearly doubled. Word had spread across Alaska and beyond about the village that refused to die, and people seeking authentic community, real connection, and a simpler life had started arriving. Among them were 2 journalists, a retired doctor, and several young families tired of city life. Emma Morrison, now 19, stood before a classroom of 8 children in Coldfoot's newly built schoolhouse. She was teaching them wilderness survival, passing down the knowledge her grandfather had given her father, and her father had given her. On the wall hung a framed photograph of that winter day 3 years ago, showing the mountain of fish on the ice and the exhausted, triumphant faces of the team. Your parents and grandparents did something incredible, Emma told the wide-eyed children. When the world said it was impossible, when every logical voice said to give up, they chose to fight. That's the spirit of Coldfoot. That's who we are. Jake Morrison had become something of a legend. He now ran wilderness survival courses during the summer months, teaching visitors from around the world the old techniques his father had mastered. His winter ice fishing expeditions had become an annual tradition, though never again under such desperate circumstances. The village now maintained proper emergency supplies, satellite communication backups, and evacuation protocols. But more importantly, They maintained the bonds forged in that brutal winter. Thomas Chen's restaurant, the Frozen Lake Cafe, had become a destination. People drove hours through Alaska's wilderness to taste his famous salmon preparations. He'd published a cookbook titled Cooking at 70 Below, which became a surprise bestseller. Every penny of profit went into Coldfoot's community fund. Old Pete, now 86, still told the story to anyone who would listen, his voice strong despite his age. He'd bounce his great-granddaughter on his knee and point to the lake visible from his window. "See that frozen water, little one? That's where miracles live, if you're brave enough to dig for them." Michael Henderson's son, born 2 months after the Great Catch, was named Jake Thomas Henderson. The boy, now almost 3, loved fish more than any other food, much to everyone's amusement. The abandoned mining shed had been converted into a museum, preserving the story of that winter. The broken hand drill, the detonator, photographs, and Jake's father's journal all sat behind glass, a testament to human resilience. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it touched your heart, moved you, or reminded you that hope exists even in the darkest, coldest moments, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us what survival story you'd like to hear next. Share this with someone who needs to remember that giving up is never the only option. Because sometimes, in the frozen heart of winter, when death knocks at your door, you don't answer. You grab your courage, gather your community, and you drill through 3 meters of ice to pull up 5,500 kilograms of salvation. And you survive.